Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Clear Company. According to research by the National Cancer Institute, nearly 40% of men and women will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in their lifetimes in the United States. This number is growing, which makes the subject of cancer in the workplace an even more common one. And I'm not just talking about benefit plan negotiations and EAPs, but the support, resources, and information that you can provide your employees in the event that a coworker, themselves, or a family member is impacted by a cancer diagnosis. Today I'm joined by Anne Fry. She is an executive leadership coach and workplace crisis consultant. I'm also delighted to call Anne my friend. Welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about your background?
Yes. I originally was a clinical social worker and got trained and MSW in order to be able to work with people therapeutically. But many things impacted my life at that time in the early years of my social work. Like my younger brother developed cancer and died within less than a year, and he was only 27. And then another brother, just a couple weeks later, was killed in a car wreck. And that was all right after I'd had a baby, and it was a real crisis moment for me in my life. And I started a hospice in my community. I was a full-time professor at the time. So I have a lot of things from my own experience, not to mention my own cancer, which we can talk about later. All of this started gestating over time. I moved into more college teaching, taught in several universities. I don't have to go into that. You can always read that on my bio. And started coaching at the executive levels, the C-level suite, or with top performers about 20 years ago, early in the days of coaching. As I've grown older and I've realized more things are happening with people, I thought that this was a direction that I wanted to do as my legacy for the rest of my life, is working with companies when they're trying to figure out how to navigate cancer and serious illness in the workplace.
Thank you for kind of giving us a little bit of history, because I think it's important to level set, because you have been through this experience and you have family members and friends. Before we get into the specifics, I do want to address a question that I think some of our readers might have, or listeners, I guess, might have on the subject of HIPAA. Now, you aren't suggesting that employers violate HIPAA and discuss private medical information. Your work is really centered around when somebody comes forth and shares their diagnosis, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I would never step on the toes of that. I wouldn't put myself at risk for that, nor anything in the company. The reality is most people, when they come in, when they get a diagnosis or that of a loved one, they come in and they talk to their boss. And oftentimes their bosses are uncomfortable with the conversation, don't know what to say, so they send them off to HR. Part of what I like to do is get involved in helping leadership be more comfortable, be more sensitive, so that when someone who works for them comes to them, they can have conversations. That leadership person should never be outed in any way by anyone other than themselves. So coworkers don't need to know unless they tell them. Everything is led by the person with the illness themselves. So it's a safe gesture.
Just a note, if you're unfamiliar with HIPAA and the Health Information Protection and Accountability Act, I do have some resources on Workology that I'll include in the transcript of this podcast as part of Anne's interview. Let's talk about maybe some ways that an employee's serious illness or a family member's can impact the workplace.
When you think about the person themselves, like I recently coached a man with cancer who worked for a major company. He was up in the Washington state area, and he had a great deal of absenteeism due to the numbers of surgeries that he had to have, the fact that it was throat cancer, and it really left him looking less than optimal, and it was hard for him to go to work and to deal with all that. And so some of the things that happen in the workplace as a result of that, a lot of absenteeism, lack of productivity, the team feels like they don't know what to do. There's less involvement, or it lowers the team involvement, not just for the person experiencing the illness, but that person's lack of presence with the team. Personally, sometimes they have to use more flex time or work from home. They have great needs for physical accommodations, a place to take a rest if they're going through treatment. Chemotherapy and radiation can knock you out. And so the biggest factor is that they are not as able to work as effectively. They want to keep their jobs, maybe need to work from home, so it calls for a lot of flexibility and flow, and the responsibilities change. The team can suffer, or if the team is privy to the information, then they can be called in and make a huge difference. But there's another way that shows up, sometimes on the opposite, where the team becomes resentful of the person who has the illness, feels like they're getting a lot of attention, they're working at home, maybe others can't work at home, productivity goes down. We could probably go on, but I think you get the picture.
That most of our listeners have probably been impacted by a coworker or a family member, or had somebody at the office. I certainly have somebody who I came into an HR role, and they were diagnosed with cancer, went through treatments, and then it was a terminal diagnosis, and unfortunately he passed away. So it impacts the workplace and the people around you, and everybody just experiences is a little bit differently. So I love that you're providing support and resources and coaching for everyone and different individuals in the office.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. Today, we're tackling a sensitive subject. We're talking about serious healthcare illness or a cancer diagnosis in the workplace, and how we can support our employees with my friend Ann Fry. You can connect with Ann Fry on Twitter at Ann Fry, ANNFRY.
This podcast is sponsored by Clear Company. Clear Company is the world's fastest growing talent management platform, allowing companies to easily hire, retain, and engage more A players. Visit clearcompany.com to sign up for a free demo.
Let's talk about some ways that employers can provide support to employees who have been diagnosed with a serious illness.
Well, I think first of all, what they need from their manager are some of what we loosely talk about as the soft skills. And that's where my work with managers comes in. If they're nervous about having the conversations once somebody comes to them, then they could use a little sensitivity training. They can use a little help in what do I say, what don't I say. But mostly what they need from their manager, we can talk about what they need from the rest of the team in a minute, is they need someone who's empathetic and who can genuinely have a conversation with them without them freaking out themselves, someone who's understanding and compassionate. They also need flexibility and generosity, certainly optimism, because very few cancer patients, for example, will come into work newly diagnosed or going through treatment who don't want to be optimistic. They're not usually coming in saying, oh, I'm going to die. They come in saying, I'm going through this and I have to have treatment and it's going to impact my life, and I need to know that you have my back and that you care about me. And so they need to know that their bosses and even their team members are concerned about their well-being, and that they aren't going to, go into really confidential issues with them, but that the team is comfortable in hearing, well, this is where I am, but I'm not comfortable dealing with the details. And they need to be able to accept that and be comfortable with that rather than probing. And I think another thing that they really need, which is important to me, is a sense of humor. I wrote a book many years ago called Laughing Matters, The Value of Humor in the Workplace. And it certainly relates to how someone going through a disease. I am a breast cancer survivor, and I know that if I did not have a sense of humor, I would have never gotten through that. I mean, I could spend a long time telling you about that, but they need to maybe have people take them out to funny movies, or coworkers, and say, hey, do you need something tonight? Let's go to a movie, or let's go hear some improv, or laugh with them, or send them funny cards, help them look at the upside. And that's something that is, that sounds, funny, because really people are so serious when they're trying to have conversations with you. And so if I can just sort of jump into that for a second, more things that they could use from their coworkers. They want to feel normal. When they come to work, they don't want anybody smothering them or hanging over them. They want things to seem normal, the person coming to work with an illness or with a loved one. They maybe want, if they're at home, they want to hear from their their coworkers to call them, or an ear to listen only if they want it. They want offers, like, especially, let's say somebody's single, what can they do to help? And briefly, what they don't need is they don't want to be treated separately. They don't want to be shunned. They don't want to have people avoid them or be afraid of them. They just kind of want to be concerned, have them concerned, but treat them like they're normal. You can tell I'm pretty passionate about all that.
Absolutely. And I love that you shared about the humor piece, because I do think that it's easy to get all serious, right? Or really concerned and forget that we need a little laughter in our lives because we're going through and experiencing a hard time.
And it was really interesting because they started to care about me, even though they were my client. And they'd say, hey, first thing, how's it going? A lot of my work was in the pharma industry. So they'd say, what's your cocktail? What are you taking? And I would, and I don't mean a drink, I mean my cancer cocktail. And then they would be very understanding, and yet I could be there for them and they could be there for me at the same time. And that was really important.
I know that when there's a big medical diagnosis or some life trauma that happens to someone, sometimes in the office we feel uncomfortable and awkward talking to them. How and can we support individuals maybe who are going through something very personal and need the support? How do we connect with them?
Yeah, there are a lot of, different scenarios that might show up in the workplace, where, you might have a CEO of a small growing company who's been diagnosed with stage 2 cancer, and you're that young person and you want to make a contribution, but you've got some treatment ahead and you don't quite know how you're going to cope with that, nor do you know how the other members of the team are going to cope with that because you're small in a startup. Another example is of a senior level professional woman who has a high-powered job, manages a really big team. You don't have cancer, but your 13-year-old daughter does. She has leukemia. And in this particular case, she's declining pretty rapidly. How do you balance your senior level management responsibilities with your need to be with your family? And yet, when somebody has cancer, people in their family need to continue working because they need to be able to afford the treatments that they need if they're not covered by insurance, or they need to go off site and perhaps go to other facilities where treatments are occurring. There's a huge impact on a person working when someone in their family is involved. Those are just a couple of examples, but there's truly, in my mind, there isn't anybody that isn't impacted. So another personal thing about me is about 5 or 6 years ago, my then 35-year-old son had malignant melanoma and had to have surgery to remove a melanoma from his scalp. It was a very, very scary time for all of us, and I left my coaching practice for a while I was living in another state, just to fly back and to be with him and to go through all the surgery. And so my clients were put on hold, and I didn't even work for a company. I just worked for myself. I can imagine what that's like, for people that are going to work and they're dealing with that. And when he took that time off, he was very lucky. It did not spread to his lymph system. So he was able to pretty much with time go back to a normal lifestyle and didn't have to go through treatment. But nonetheless, he thought he'd be back to work in a couple of days, and actually he was away from work for several days, just kind of dealing with that. And so there's scenarios at all levels. And for me, I've certainly had enough cancer in my lifetime between my loved ones and my kid and myself, and I see what it does to people. And I want to be, and I'm there as a coach to be able to support them when they're going through their own or that of their loved ones.
One thing I also wanted to make sure that we've talked about, because we have talked about cancer and or serious illness and that it's hard on individuals and family members. But after diagnosis, 40% of cancer patients report developing a significant distress that can include worry, panic attacks, depression, PTSD, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder. And this research comes to us from the Anxiety and Depression Association Society of America. I think that we tend to look at just the diagnosis of cancer or other traumatic disease, but we should also consider things like mental health. What are your kind of thoughts on this? Like, how can we support our employees and families in this way?
Yeah, I think you make a really valid point. I mean, once you've had a major heart attack, cancer, or something debilitating like that, and you go through a long curative stage, you live the rest of your life not necessarily always thinking about it, but every time you have to go to the doctor again, for example, you go into some kind of crisis fear about, are they going to tell me that it's back? Has it spread? For me, I'm 9 years clean out of breast cancer, and I only have to go once a year now to see an oncologist, but you better believe that when I go to that visit, I'm pretty nervous, and I get anxious for several days before that. And so that's just one example of the kind of anxiety. People get depressed. They're afraid that it's going to come back. Or if it's a chronic illness, like kidney dysfunction, and you go for dialysis and then you go to work, or even if it's some other kind of mental illness, like the dementia of your parent, or something, you're always in some kind of a hyper-tense panic that something's going to go wrong. It's not dissimilar from a PTSD kind of response for someone who's been at war, comes back, and is fearful of what's going to be next. And so being clear about that in the training that I do, because I have a mental health background, I'm able to bring that out. The anxiety, the fear, the depression, they're depressed. It takes a long time. When I went through chemo, that was not fun, and it made me sick, and I'd sleep for days. When I went through radiation, it completely wiped out my immune system. It made me exhausted all the time. And I have two autoimmune diseases as a result of that. Now, they would never say that was a result of it. I know it's a result of it. And so I constantly deal with some chronic pain from that. And I worry about how that's going to impact my ability to work. So I'm sure that goes on for many other people that have that experience. You can't separate the mental concerns from the physical illnesses that people are going through. And if it's not about them, then it's certainly about their loved ones. Think about all the aging boomers that are dealing with their parents who are now experiencing major illness. You go to work every day. What if you have a parent with dementia and they're calling in and you are anxious all the time, and then you have to jump in your car and you have to go and take care of them, and you wonder what's going to happen, and what if you have to put them into some kind of a facility and there's no way to do. So there's anxiety and depression all the time. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes, and I did want to mention the aging population, because there are a number of our employees that we're working with that are caretakers, not just to kids, but also to their older parents and relatives.
Yeah, that's what they call the sandwich generation. You're just right there between your own kids and your parents. I don't have any statistics that would back this up, but I would bet that probably 50 to 70% of the people that go to work every day are not just concerned about themselves, but are incredibly concerned about everything that's going on. And then you've got all the other issues you can bring in, the mental issues, but also you can bring in substance abuse, people going through that. It's overwhelming. Plus, not to mention all the PTSD from all the people coming back from the military.
It's a lot to handle.
It is a lot to handle. And you know what? It's interesting to me that companies do not overwhelmingly understand the need for the kind of training that they can have that would help them better cope with this and know how to help the employees that are going through it. And certainly many of them are being served by short-term counseling with their employee assistance programs, but that's not the same as training the management team. And it's also not long-term, whereas coaching can help them take all the pieces of their life between their work life, their family life, their illness life, and help them cope with all of it at the same time. So that's sort of my message.
Let's talk a little bit about the training, more about the work that you do and how you tend to work with employers in these areas.
Well, in the best of all possible worlds, I mean, there's many ways it can take. Like I said, this last one was somebody that I used to coach who called me in, who wanted me to work with somebody under him, also a high-level executive who reported directly to this other gentleman. And he said he's having a hard time dealing with having cancer. And the man was divorced, and he had children in their teens, and he couldn't go to work because he was terribly disfigured for a while. And so that manager that sent me to work with this man was sensitive enough to realize that, but others are not. So when I do trainings, I usually do a 4 to 8 hour training with managers, like preferably when they're off at a retreat. They're not in their building, they're not being interfered with their day. They go off-site for 4 or 8 hours training, and I teach them what they need to know about serious illness and what the patient experience is like and how it impacts the company and what the employees need and don't need from them, and what to say and what not to say, and when to talk. And so it's communication skills training, and it's also how to develop that sense of positivity and bring some humor in around the issue, and how to create an environment at work that helps all the employees, those impacted directly and those who work with them, and engage them. It really is about employee engagement wrapped around a need to be able to be there in support of another person and yet not compromise productivity and therefore profitability. So if a company brings someone like me in to do that training, they are much more able to handle the situations when they come up. And if they want me to do some coaching with someone who might have that, that's a bonus. But even if I can get in and do the training and show them more ways that they can handle these situations when they come up, I think it's like sensitivity training. It's also diversity training. This is a diverse population, that we need to address and help them learn how to function in the workplace. So that's what it's about. And many companies are concerned about people's wellness, and they put a lot of money into wellness in organizations. But you know what? Wellness doesn't always keep people from still getting diseases or their loved ones from still getting diseases. And so it's a simplistic panacea to say, we'll just pay for them to go to the gym. That's not quite it. I think you still have to help them after they develop into a physical illness or an emotional illness. You need to develop the staff to be prepared for that.
And where can people go to learn more about your work in this area and what you do?
Well, they can go to my website, annfry.com, which talks a lot about the leadership coaching I do. There's also a segment in there called What Else Does Ann Do? And if they go to that section and kind of scroll down, I'm going to put that up at the top, by the way, but they can see that and they can actually see a little video about that. Also, I talk about it on my LinkedIn page, so they can go to LinkedIn and, search for me, Ann Fry. There's a considerable conversation about that. If they were to Google me, Ann Fry, and look for cancer articles, there have been many articles published over the last several years, and they can catch up with me that way.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's an important topic to be out in the world. I appreciate it.
Are you stuck maintaining your HRCI insurance certifications? Learn by Workology is an on-demand learning system making recertification simple. Visit workology.com/learn or text Workology to 55678 to learn more. Text 55678 to Workology. Now, back to the podcast.
This topic is extremely important, as Ann mentioned, and it's not just about wellness, but about supporting our employees throughout their career with us. The truth is that our personal lives are bleeding over into our work ones, and that is especially true when it comes to a serious illness or diagnosis like cancer, not just for ourselves, but for our family and friends. I'll never forget the feeling I had as an HR professional talking with an employee and his wife. We talked about his options for his life insurance and how he could file a claim once it was determined that his cancer was terminal. I carry this memory with me everywhere. And I remember the feeling, I still have chills, of that phone call that I got when he had passed. We need to be thinking about the different ways that we can provide our employees assistance in all areas of their lives. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, visit Workology to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.